The call came at an unexpected time. The number on the display was familiar, but the voice on the other end carried an unfamiliar urgency. "She's with her lover at a romantic dinner," said my wife's best friend, and for a moment, everything around me seemed to stop. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and furious heat rose to my face. The air felt heavy inside my lungs. I wanted to believe that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a joke in bad taste. But it wasn't. I knew. The intuition that I had been stifling for months was finally screaming so loudly that there was no way I could ignore it anymore. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and before I knew it, I was on the way to the restaurant, a whirlwind of emotions pushing me like an unstoppable storm. Every closed lighthouse was torture. Every minute seemed like an eternity. I arrived at the restaurant and what I saw confirmed my worst nightmares. There she was, sitting across from a man who wasn't me, smiling, throwing back her hair, gently touching his hand on the table. The looks they exchanged had a nauseating intimacy. That complicity was not born there, that night. It was something cultivated, matured, watered over the time I was being made an idiot of. My fists clenched, my heart hammered inside my chest, and a bitter taste filled my mouth. I could feel the betrayal burning into my skin like acid. How did she have the courage? How could you look into my eyes every day and still deceive me like that? I picked up my cell phone, and with shaking hands, I started recording. If she thought this night would be unforgettable, I would guarantee it would be. I recorded every detail, every touch, every smile. Her face lit up with a happiness that, for a long time, I hadn't seen next to me. The passionate look she reserved for another man. My legs wanted to move forward, my hands wanted to act, my voice wanted to scream and expose the whole charade there, in front of everyone. But no. I needed to be smarter. She wouldn't see me explode. She would see me win. I didn't give myself the right to act on impulse. I left there and went home, where I knew I would have the advantage. I opened our closet, looked at all her clothes hanging there, each piece representing moments that now seemed like lies. Our picture frames scattered around the house stared at me like silent witnesses to my naivety. I took everything that belonged to her and threw it into suitcases. But it wasn't enough. No. This wouldn't just be a breakup, it would be a spectacle. She didn't deserve a simple goodbye. She deserved an outcome worthy of her betrayal. Then I remembered the prenup. A document we signed years ago, when we were too young and confident to believe we would ever need it. But there was my salvation. She didn't know it, but that contract left her with nothing if she committed adultery. Every penny, every possession, every comfort she had by my side would evaporate the moment I tasted what she did. And I had proof. I had a video, witnesses, dates, messages. All. She didn't just cheat on me. She threw her life away without even realizing it. Now, sitting in the armchair, holding a glass of wine in my hand, I wait. I wait for the time when she opens the door, believing that she will return home as if nothing had happened. I wait for the moment when your eyes meet the packed bags, when your voice wavers as you ask me what's going on. I wait for the moment when she realizes that her world has fallen apart. Because tomorrow, when the sun rises, I will no longer be the deceived man. I will be the man who destroyed the woman who tried to destroy him. The sound of the key turning in the lock interrupts my thoughts. She's here. The game started. But what she doesn't know is that the worst part is yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, the betrayal no is romanticized, no is justified and never will be supported. All the stories are fictional, but the message is real. Betrayal destroys homes, erodes trust and leaves scars that never disappear. The objective is to show the consequences of each choice and the bitter price of disloyalty. Get ready, because the story you're about to hear is shocking, intense and full of twists and turns. Hold on tight, because the truth always comes out. From the beginning, everyone who knew Daniel and Isabella they said they were the perfect couple. They met when they were young, when life seemed to be an infinite promise of sunny days and starry nights. He was a determined man, with a sharp intelligence and a sense of humor that captivated anyone. She was delicate and sophisticated, but with a presence that dominated any environment. When they were together, the harmony was undeniable. The love between the two blossomed quickly, an intense passion that soon turned into commitment. The wedding came after 4 years of dating, an unforgettable ceremony for friends and family. The house they chose to build their life together was a reflection of this relationship, elegant, organized and full of memories being created every day. For years, they were the perfect hosts for dinners, parties and meetings with friends, always sharing the image of a loving and stable couple. Daniel's routine was hectic, always involved in work, ensuring a secure future for both of them. He had ambition, something Isabella always admired. His effort was visible in every decision he made, every night he spent at the office to deliver perfect projects. But success had a price. Romantic dinners began to be postponed, conversations in bed began to diminish and, little by little, the once vibrant marriage began to settle into comfortable predictability. Isabella, on the other hand, always maintained her social essence. She liked to go out, to feel admired, to be the woman that everyone noticed when entering a place. Still, for years, she was the dedicated wife, understanding Daniel's efforts and adapting to the new phase of the relationship. However, something has changed. Small details started to become noticeable. Her gaze seemed more distant some nights. The phone, previously left on the table without concern, now lived face down. The laughs they once shared when remembering moments from the past seemed increasingly rare. Daniel started to notice, but didn't want to believe it. He preferred to convince himself that it was just a phase, like so many others they faced. The work was demanding more of him, and he was relying on the idea that, by stabilizing his career, he would have time to rekindle the flame of marriage. Isabella, in turn, felt trapped between two versions of herself. The woman who built a home next to a man who, despite his absence, still treated her with respect and affection, and the woman who longed for something new, a feeling that made her feel alive again. She fought this urge, tried to ignore it, but as the months passed, it became impossible to quell the restlessness growing inside her. Her friends began to notice this change. The best of them, Mariana, once warned her, saying that every marriage goes through ups and downs and that throwing everything away for a moment of impulse could be an irreversible mistake. But Isabella didn't want advice. The house that was once a haven of love now felt like a cage. The walls decorated with photos of travels and happy moments seemed to remind her of what was at risk, but also of what had been lost. The candlelit dinner, prepared by Daniel in an attempt to rekindle the connection, was received by her with a forced smile. He noticed. He felt something was wrong, but he didn't know what. He asked if everything was okay, and she responded with a simple, "I'm tired." The nights together became quieter. He started working late. She started going out with her friends more. Daniel, deep down, wanted to believe that everything was just a matter of time. After all, they've been through tough times before and have always found their way back to each other. But something bothered him. Her perfume seemed different some nights, the messages on her cell phone came more frequently, but were never commented on. Isabella's behavior was changing, and he was beginning to feel like he was no longer part of her world. The confidence, once solid, began to show almost imperceptible cracks, but deep enough to plant doubt in his heart. The truth was that Isabella was experiencing an internal storm. She tried to convince herself that she still loved Daniel in the same way, but the emotion, that intensity she felt at the beginning, seemed to have faded. The moments when he would touch your hand at the dinner table, which once made your heart race, now seemed like mere automatic gestures. She wondered if this was what it meant to be married for so long, if it was normal, this transition from rapture to almost lukewarm comfort. Maybe it was just the monotony taking over. Maybe it was more than that. But Daniel was still there. Even with his suspicions growing, even with his intuition telling him that something was out of place, he refused to see it. He refused to believe that something so strong, so real, could be dissolving without him noticing in time. He started trying to recover the moments, to be more present, to surprise her, as he used to do in their first years together. But every time he got closer, it seemed like she was already too far away. The clock ticked, the weeks dragged by, and the space between them became bigger and bigger. But what Daniel didn't know was that everything was about to change. The truth he was still trying to ignore approached like a wave about to crash, and once it did, there would be no turning back. He didn't know it yet, but within a few days, he would be facing the biggest upheaval of his life. And when that happened, he would no longer be the same. The days dragged on as if each one was a piece of a puzzle that Daniel couldn't fit together. There was something in the air, an invisible tension that he couldn't ignore, but also couldn't name. Isabella seemed increasingly distant, although she tried, at times, to compensate for this absence with calculated gestures. Little hurried kisses before leaving, short messages saying I loved him, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Daniel wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she was overwhelmed, or that maybe she was just dealing with something internal that she didn't know how to express. But deep down, the doubt grew. Like weeds that spread silently through a garden before suffocating everything around them. Her habits began to change in subtle ways. Small details that, in isolation, could mean nothing, but that, together, created a scenario that was impossible to ignore. The cell phone, always nearby, vibrating more than normal. The clothes, chosen with more care, the perfume more intense than usual. The excuses for arriving late, the rush to disconnect calls when he entered the room. Everything seemed to fit into a pattern that Daniel didn't want to see. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that his mind was setting traps, but intuition burned into his skin like a warning he could no longer silence. It was on a Friday night that something inside him broke. Isabella had left early, saying that she would meet Mariana for dinner, something she had done before, but that night, felt different. The way she avoided looking him in the eye, the way she held the phone tighter than necessary when leaving the house, the nervousness that showed even when she tried to look natural. Everything indicated that something was happening. Daniel stayed in the room, trying to ignore the thoughts that tormented him, but every minute that passed seemed to pull him deeper into the abyss of uncertainty. It was only when Mariana, Isabella's best friend, called that everything started to make sense. The voice on the other end of the line carried a weight that he felt before the words were even spoken. There was no beating around the bush, just the naked truth that hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. Isabella was not with her. There was no dinner with friends. She was in a restaurant, on a date that had nothing to do with friendship. Daniel's silence was loaded with meaning. His mind swirled in a mixture of anger, disbelief and a cutting pain that seemed to rip something out of him. The path to the restaurant was covered at a speed that defied any limit. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. At every traffic light, at every turn, the thought of seeing her with another man became more real. He didn't know what he would do when he arrived, he didn't know if he would have the strength to face her, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to make sure he wasn't being paranoid, that this was all more than just guesswork. And when he parked in front of the restaurant and saw her, through the wide glass wall, there were no more doubts. She was there, sitting at the table, smiling at a man who wasn't him. Her hands rested on his, her eyes sparkled with something Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. It was the look of a woman in love. Blood boiled in his veins. The hands were shaking. Breathing was heavy, irregular. For an instant, he felt that the ground was opening beneath his feet, that everything he had built with her was being undone before his eyes. The betrayal wasn't just the touching, the kisses that had probably already happened, or what would come after that night. It was time, complicity, accumulated lies. It was knowing that, while he was at home, believing that everything could be resolved, she had already made the decision to follow another path. A path that did not include him. Daniel took out his cell phone, activated the camera and started recording. I needed to register. I needed to have proof. But most of all, he needed to remember this moment so he would never allow himself to doubt himself again. To never question your instincts again. He watched helplessly as the man grabbed her hand and pulled her closer. She didn't resist. On the contrary, he seemed to want it. Her laughter echoed like an insult. He didn't need to hear it to know what was being said. It didn't matter. What mattered was that now everything was clear. Adrenaline was exploding inside him, but he didn't enter the restaurant. I didn't want a dramatic scene, I didn't want screams, tears or empty apologies. I didn't want to be the betrayed man who causes a spectacle for a curious public. He needed something bigger. Something definitive. He left the restaurant with the videos recorded, the evidence in hand and a plan already beginning to form. The pain was still a sharp blade on his skin, but now, it was mixed with something colder, more lethal. Isabella thought she would get away with it. That I could continue living as if nothing had happened. But she was wrong. She didn't know what awaited her. And when he found out, it would be too late. The night was silent when Isabella entered the house. He closed the door carefully, trying to avoid any noise that could alert Daniel. The clock on the wall read almost midnight, and she kicked off her shoes, sliding her feet across the cold wooden floor, feeling a shiver run up her spine. Dinner had been perfect. Every detail, every gesture exchanged, every whispered word had been a piece carefully fitted into a puzzle that she tried to keep hidden. She felt alive, wanted, and even though there was an uncomfortable weight in the back of her mind, she ignored it. But when taking the first step into the room, the discomfort became something much more real. Daniel was there, sitting on the couch, waiting for her. The fixed gaze, the rigid posture. On the coffee table, a half-empty bottle of wine and his cell phone next to it, as if there was something there that required his constant attention. The silence was dense, full of meanings that she still didn't fully understand. He didn't say anything right away, just watched as she approached hesitantly, her eyes searching for an explanation for the strange atmosphere. Her throat went dry. He took a deep, slow breath before breaking the silence. His voice was low, without any trace of explosive anger, but carried with a cutting weight. "Did you have a good night?" The question echoed around the room, filled with calculated coldness. Isabella hesitated for a moment, forcing an uncertain smile. "Yes, Mariana and I went to a new restaurant. It was pleasant." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He leaned forward slightly, picking up the phone and sliding the screen with his thumb before turning the device towards her. The video started playing. Isabella's heart stopped for a moment when she recognized her own image, sitting at the table, smiling, touching the hand of a man who was definitely not her husband. Her breathing became ragged, and her face turned pale. "Do you want to try again?" Daniel's voice was sharp like a sharp blade. The silence lengthened, and Isabella felt her stomach turn. There was no escaping it. There was no excuse, there was no way around the facts. The tremor in her hands betrayed her guilt, but still, she tried to maintain the charade. "Daniel. I can explain," he let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "Explain what?" "That while I was here, trying to understand why you were so distant, you were with him. That every time you said you loved me, you were lying. That the excuses for leaving later were to meet up with him." He stood up, anger finally boiling over, his eyes shining with a mix of pain and fury. "I knew something was wrong. I felt it. But you had the audacity to look me in the eye every day and pretend nothing was happening." Isabella tried to get closer, but he retreated, as if her touch was something repulsive. "Daniel, please listen to me. It's not like you think." Her voice was shaking, tears were already beginning to form, but he just shook his head in disbelief. "Isn't that what I'm thinking?" he repeated, laughing bitterly. "I saw it, Isabella. I saw everything. But do you know what hurts me most? It's not just the fact that you cheated on me. It's the fact that you destroyed something I believed to be unbreakable. You threw away years of your life together for this. He pointed at his cell phone, contempt dripping through his words. Despair began to take over her. She knew she would lose everything if she couldn't reverse that situation. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control. I made a mistake. I was confused. I felt alone, Daniel. You were always so busy, and I just wanted, what did I just want? A distraction. Someone who made you feel something different. His voice rose, and his gaze became even harder. I was busy trying to secure a future for both of us. I always put this house, this marriage, first. But you chose to betray all of this. And you know what's worse? He came closer, his eyes boring into hers, cold as never before. You won't be left with anything. Isabella blinked, confused. What do you mean? His smile was cruel, a reflection of the pain he felt. The prenuptial contract, Isabella. That document we signed years ago when we thought we'd never need it. The one who said that, in the case of adultery, the guilty party leaves with nothing. Homeless. No money. With absolutely nothing. The shock hit Isabella like a punch to the chest. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a gasp of disbelief. No, that can't be, he can. And it is. He picked up an envelope from the table and threw it towards her. All the papers are ready. I have enough evidence to ensure the judge doesn't even hesitate. You will not leave here as my betrayed wife. You will leave here a woman who has lost everything. Her legs wobbled. The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. My mind was spinning, trying to process the extent of the disaster that had just occurred. Daniel, please, we can talk about this. It can't end like this, but he just smiled, a smile that no longer carried love, only disappointment. It's over, Isabella. The only reason you're still here is because I wanted you to know exactly what you lost. She felt hot tears running down her face, but he didn't move. He offered no comfort. He offered nothing other than the certainty that this was the end. And as the reality of her ruin fell upon her like a crushing weight, Isabella realized, too late, that some choices have no return. Isabella felt her legs weak as she held the papers that Daniel had thrown on the table. Her heart was hammering against her chest, and her hands were shaking, as if the mere contact with those leaves could burn her skin. She scanned the document, each line like a knife to her pride. The contract was real. She knew the signatures at the bottom of the page well, her own handwriting next to his. That piece of paper sealed her ruin, dismantled any argument, any plea she could try. The mouth opened, as if trying to form a sentence, but nothing came out. Daniel walked away slowly, his steps echoing through the room, each movement filled with a firmness that Isabella had never seen in him before. He was not the man she knew. There was something new about him, a hardness that sent a chill down her spine. When he finally managed to muster the strength to speak, his voice was shaky, filled with despair. It can't be like this, Daniel, please, we can talk, it doesn't have to be so definitive. He laughed, but there was no humor in his expression. Definitive? He shook his head, crossing his arms. You betrayed me, Isabella. You threw years of marriage in the trash, and what are you waiting for? For me to sit down with you and talk like two rational adults? For me to pretend this was some mistake and just accept it? No. I'm not that kind of man. You don't deserve the benefit of the conversation. She took a step forward, ignoring the urge to step back when she realized he wouldn't move to comfort her. I made a mistake. I know I made a mistake. But you need to give me a chance. I can fix this, to repair. He interrupted her, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes were cold, calculating. How exactly do you intend to fix something you destroyed? Tell me, Isabella. Will you erase everything you did? Will you give back the nights you spent in the arms of another man? Will you undo the lies you told every time you left here pretending to be my faithful wife? Will you regain the respect I had for you? She felt a lump form in her throat. I knew there was no answer to that. He was right. There was nothing that could be done to turn back. But still, he clung to the slightest hope that remained, because accepting that situation meant accepting the end of the comfortable life he led. I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel. I was lost. I felt alone, and everything happened so fast that, he raised his hand, silencing her with a simple gesture. Don't give me lame excuses. You had a choice. You always have. And he chose to betray me. The silence between them was dense, heavy, only interrupted by the sound of her shaky breathing. He picked up a larger envelope that was on the table next to him and handed it over without hesitation. I scheduled your move for tomorrow. Your things will be picked up from here and sent to a hotel. After that, you turn around. I don't care where you go anymore. Her eyes widened. You can't be serious, are you kicking me out? He let out a tired sigh, as if he was exhausted from the conversation. No, Isabella. You kicked yourself out the moment you chose to betray me. I'm just reminding you of that. She threw herself on the sofa, running her hands over her face, feeling the tears fall in despair. The future she thought she could control slipped out of her hands like sand. Her plan crumbled before her. No matter how much he wanted to resist, no matter how much he tried to regain some control of the situation, there was no way out. You're taking revenge on me. This isn't justice, Daniel, it's revenge. He tilted his head to the side, watching her curiously. Maybe it is. But if it is, it's fair revenge. Her mind swirled, trying to find a way, some silver lining in it. And what should I do now? Did I lose everything? My house? My comfort? My wedding? He smiled bitterly, picking up the glass of wine and swirling the liquid inside the glass. You didn't lose. You switched. You traded all that for a few nights of adventure with another man. And now he's paying the price. She wanted to scream, she wanted to hit him, she wanted to break that unshakable posture, to make him feel at least a little of the despair that consumed her. But when I looked into his eyes, I knew there was nothing more I could do. The door of the house opened, and Mariana entered without knocking, her eyes full of concern. I came as soon as I heard. She stopped when she saw Isabella collapsed on the sofa and Daniel motionless, cold, as if that scene had already been resolved for him. Mariana looked from one to the other, feeling the tension in the air. Daniel, can we talk for a minute? He nodded, walking towards the office, and Mariana followed him. As soon as they entered the room, she closed the door and faced him. Are you sure you want to do it this way? He laughed in disbelief. Did you expect me to do it any other way? What do you want me to do, Mariana? Hug Isabella and tell her everything is okay? What do I understand? She sighed, crossing her arms. I just want you to make sure you don't regret this later. You're hurt, and I understand. But this kind of thing can consume a person. Do you want this anger to dominate you for the rest of your life? He ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. I'm not letting anger control me. I'm moving on. Without her. Mariana nodded slowly. And you think you can do it? Daniel looked through the half-open door, seeing Isabella sunk on the sofa, lost in her own misfortune. He took a deep breath and responded, without hesitation. I don't think so. I'm sure. He left the office, leaving Mariana behind as he headed for the room door. Before leaving, he turned to Isabella one last time. Tomorrow, you won't be here anymore. Don't try to look for me. Don't try to ask for anything else. What we had no longer exists. She opened her mouth to speak, but he had already left, leaving her alone in the room, surrounded by her own destruction. The weight of his decision was absolute, and for the first time in a long time, she realized she was completely alone. The house was silent when Isabella finally realized the crushing weight of her reality. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every little detail around him now seemed to belong to him for just a few more hours. His mind refused to accept the truth, but there was nowhere else to run. She looked around, feeling like a visitor to the place she had called home for years. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed longer, and the only thing filling the space was the feeling of a deep emptiness growing inside her. Mariana was still there, watching her with a mix of pity and exasperation. The friend knew that this moment would come, but seeing Isabella in that state, torn apart, was something that not even she could completely process. She walked slowly to the sofa and sat down next to her, waiting for the other woman to speak first. Time passed, but Isabella couldn't say anything. The words seemed useless, empty, without any purpose. What could be said? That you were sorry? That I didn't want things to end like this? Who would give anything to go back in time? None of these sentences would bring Daniel back, and inside her, the bitter certainty grew, he really was gone forever. Mariana broke the silence, her voice low, almost a whisper. What are you going to do now? Isabella blinked slowly, as if she had been pulled out of a trance. His eyes were swollen, red, and his mouth was dry. She tried to laugh, but the sound came out choked, without any humor. I don't know. I don't even know where to go. Her friend sighed, leaning forward, resting her elbows on her knees. You need to get up. Sitting here wallowing in this isn't going to change anything. But change what? Everything was already destroyed. The idea of leaving the house the next day seemed absurd. The place was yours as much as it was his. She built that life with Daniel, and now she would be kicked out as if it were a throwaway mistake. But was that all that was left? Accept defeat, grab your bags and disappear. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. I need to talk to him again. Mariana turned her face away, her gaze filled with disbelief. Are you crazy? He's already said everything he needed to. You saw how he was, Isabella. There's no going back. She knew that. But still, I felt like I needed to try. Even if there was nothing more to be said, I needed to face Daniel one last time, I needed to see him without that look of hatred, without that unbearable coldness. He stood up suddenly, adrenaline taking over his body. She picked up her cell phone and dialed his number, knowing it was useless. The ringing echoed in the silence of the house, and the lack of response was the final confirmation. Mariana stood up too, crossing her arms. You need to accept it, Isa. It's done. Tomorrow, you leave here and start from scratch. But starting from scratch was something I had never considered. Life had always been planned out before her, with no room for such absolute failures. The betrayal had been a mistake she thought she could handle without consequences, but now it was all slipping through her fingers. She walked around the room as if she could find an answer hidden among the furniture, as if there was an invisible button that could reverse everything, but all she found were the shadows of the empty house, echoing the inescapable truth: she was alone. The next morning, the boxes were already stacked in the hallway. The sound of porters going up and down the stairs made every movement inside the house feel like a blow, a final slam of a judge's gavel sentencing her. The smell of coffee that used to fill the mornings with Daniel was no longer there. The radio, which always played a soft tune as they prepared for the day, was turned off. And for the first time, the silence hurt more than any words spoken the night before. Daniel wasn't there when she left. And that was what hurt the most. He didn't even want to see her go. No goodbye, no last exchange of glances, no trace of the man who once loved her. Just the absence. When she arrived at the hotel where she would stay for an indefinite period of time, she felt suffocated. The small room, the impersonal furniture, the lack of any trace of his former life. He opened the bags, but he couldn't unpack anything. The weight of the past was still on his back, and the only thing he could do was sit on the edge of the bed and stare into space. The messages on the cell phone started arriving. Mariana asking if she was okay, colleagues offering support, some curious friends wanting to know details. But the one notification she really wanted never appeared. No sign of Daniel. Time passed, and the void was not filled. He tried to move on, he tried to convince himself that he could start over, but every day seemed more difficult. I spent hours looking at my cell phone screen, considering calling him, but I never had the courage. I knew his voice would be indifferent. I knew there was no going back. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't allow himself to look back. He moved on with his life, refusing to let what happened consume him. But there were inevitable moments. When you wake up and notice the bed is empty, when you get home and no longer find her perfume permeating the air, when you open drawers and find traces of what they once were. But he chose to follow. He chose to leave behind the woman he once loved, the woman who destroyed everything with her own hands. And Isabella, sunk in her own regret, began to understand that some betrayals are unforgivable. That certain losses are irreversible. That the price of her choices was not just losing Daniel, but losing herself in the process. And this, perhaps, was the cruelest punishment of all. Time passed like a dense fog that Isabella was unable to cross. The hotel where she was staying became a prison, each day the same as the next, each dawn bringing the same crushing weight of her reality. The white walls of the room seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with memories she didn't want to face. There were no longer luxurious dinners, there was no longer the family routine that once seemed unbreakable. There was only the echo of his own loneliness. The nights were long, filled with insomnia and thoughts that ran like an endless movie. Daniel's face, his cold gaze, the words he had spoken to her with unshakable certainty. She tried to move on, tried to pretend she could rebuild her life as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't that simple. Every place she went reminded her of him, every automatic gesture brought back the habits they had cultivated together over the years. He found himself looking at his phone, waiting for a miracle, a message, a sign that there was still something to be saved. But he never called. Never responded. He had disappeared from her life as if she had never existed. The first week he tried to keep himself busy. He looked for a new apartment, tried to find a routine that made sense. But things felt unreal, like I was living in someone else's body. Mariana was still close by, insisting that she leave, that she do something different, but Isabella closed herself in a cocoon of self-punishment. Meals were mechanical, sleep was intermittent. Everything that once made sense now seemed purposeless. And then, one day, Mariana showed up unannounced, her eyes full of a mixture of frustration and concern. She entered the room and looked around, taking in the still untouched suitcases, the untouched furniture, the mess of a fallen life. "You can't go on like this." Her voice was firm, but there was a pleading tone. "You have to leave this room, you have to breathe. You can't sink like that." Isabella ran her hands over her face, exhausted. "I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. Do you think it's easy?" Mariana crossed her arms, looking at her sternly. "Easy? Of course it's not easy. You destroyed your marriage, Isabella. What did you expect? That it was just a mistake that Daniel would forget after a while? That he would forgive you and everything would go back to normal? Do you have any idea what you did?" Isabella's chest tightened with the raw truth of her friend's words. "I already know that. I already know I lost everything." Mariana sighed, sitting down next to her. "You can still start again. But don't be afraid to face reality. You need to get out of here." She was silent for a long moment before finally nodding her head. She didn't know where to go, but staying here wouldn't get her anywhere. That same night, he decided to go for a walk. She walked through the streets aimlessly, feeling the cold wind against her skin, trying to find something that would make her feel alive again. He stopped in front of a cafe he used to go to with Daniel. The place was exactly the same, but it seemed to belong to another world, another life. He entered hesitantly and ordered a coffee, sitting in a discreet corner. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the muffled sound of conversations around her, and for a moment, she felt out of place, as if she were observing everything from the outside. Then, he heard a familiar voice. A laugh he knew well. He turned slowly and, on the other side of the cafe, he saw Daniel. He was sitting with a woman. They were talking, and there was a sparkle in his eyes that Isabella hadn't seen in a long time. Her chest immediately tightened, and the pain was overwhelming. Daniel moved on. He looked fine. Even better. While she was wallowing in regret and loneliness, he had found a new path. The woman he was with was beautiful, elegant. I laughed at the things he said, and he smiled back in a way that Isabella hadn't seen in a long time. Her hand shook as she held the cup. I wanted to get up, go to him, say something. But what could you say? What could I do? He had erased her from his life. And now, seeing him like this, so serene, so far from the pain she still carried, she realized that she would never have a place by his side again. She left the cafe before he noticed her. She walked aimlessly, the cold air cutting into her skin, but the pain inside her was much deeper. He wouldn't look back. He wouldn't bear the weight of what happened. And, for the first time, Isabella knew that she was truly alone. Time passed like a relentless river, carrying with it the wreckage of what was once a shared life. Isabella tried to move on, but the feeling of loss was something that clung to her like a weight that was impossible to let go of. Each attempt at a fresh start seemed to be crushed by the deafening silence of the consequences. She had never imagined that betrayal would take her to such a cold and lonely place. The nights were still long, and the days seemed empty, filled only by the echo of what had been destroyed. The cafe where she last saw Daniel became a place she avoided. His look, so distant, so free of any feeling for her, was the final blow that made her understand that he would never look back. He tried to convince himself that this was just a phase, that he would eventually find a way to rebuild his life. But the truth was cruel, everything she tried seemed pointless. Job opportunities were scarce, the trust of her former friends had been shaken, and she increasingly found herself without direction, without purpose, without anyone. Mariana did what she could to help her, but even her friend's patience began to run out. He tried everything, encouraging her to seek therapy, to get involved in new projects, to leave the house. But Isabella was sinking deeper and deeper into her own shadow. Regret was no longer just a feeling, it had become a prison. Even Mariana, who had been by his side for so long, realized that she couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. And so, slowly, Isabella became truly alone. Daniel, on the other hand, found a new life. He rebuilt himself from the pieces left over from his destroyed marriage, but he never allowed bitterness to consume him. He used pain as fuel to grow, to change, to not let himself be defined by the betrayal he suffered. Time was kind to him. The weight of disappointment lessened, the wounds healed, and he found something he thought he had lost forever: peace. The woman he met months later brought a new lease of life into his life. Unlike Isabella, she never played games, never hid the truth, never tried to manipulate his feelings. It was simple, genuine, and that was enough. One night, as Daniel walked along the avenue where he used to meet Isabella for dinner in the past, his thoughts wandered to everything that had happened. There was no more anger. There was no more pain. Just the certainty that all that is behind us. He didn't miss her. I didn't wish things had been different. The end of his marriage had been the beginning of a new phase, a phase he would never have experienced if he hadn't been betrayed. Sometimes great destruction brings unexpected reconstruction. Isabella, on the other hand, realized too late that some things cannot be fixed. The pride that made her believe she could lead a double life was the same one that made her lose everything. Marriage, stability, respect, even friends. Everything disappeared. Deep down, what hurt her most was not having lost Daniel, but realizing that he would never again look at her with love, with desire, with that admiration that had once been her security. Time continued to pass, but the marks of what happened never completely erased. Each one followed their own path, but the betrayal left traces that could never be completely forgotten. Some mistakes are irreversible, some choices have a price too high to be paid, and, in the end, everyone reaped exactly what they sowed. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment your opinion, say which part impacted you the most and whether you think Daniel made the right decision. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, here, betrayal will never be justified, because consequences always come.